where were you born? A little bit about your childhood, where you grew up.
I was born in a little small city in Alabama, Opelika, Alabama, Lee County. And I remember quite a bit about my childhood because I was born during the Second World War, just before the Second World War. And my father was drafted during the Second World War, and I was raised by my grandmother. My mother went to work in a textile mill in Opelika to take care of us. And my sister and I was raised by my grandmother. So my childhood was really rewarding to me, but it was quite difficult as I look back and compare it to nowadays. I didn't realize that it was difficult at the time, but I've had to work all of my life. It seemed like life has been a tremendous struggle just to survive. So that's basically my childhood, you know. But one of the most rewarding aspects is, I think, is my grandmother. She taught me never to have hate in your heart. And she taught me how to read out of a Bible. And she used to read to me and my sister every day. And my sister, she passed away in 1990. And there's a story in itself, because I introduced her to her husband, who was a draftee when I volunteered to go into the Army. And he married my sister, and they lived together 31 years. And then when he died, she didn't want to live anymore, and just kind of 1 year later, she died. So that was quite emotional to me. So.
Now, I think I was reading that you had a number of relatives. So your father was in the military? So
Yes, he was.
Too. Was that a reason you decided to join?
That was one of the reasons, because of the draft. My father was drafted, and everything that we did at home with my grandmother, it seemed like we were making cookies and saving syrup cans so we could pack cookies in them to send to the, you know, the people that were fighting the war, you know, the soldiers that were fighting the war. And Opelika is right near a highway. It's only 28 miles from Fort Benning, Georgia. So as a little kid, I could see all these military trucks going back and forth to Fort Benning. And I was talking before we started the interview about jumping out of airplanes. And I'll never forget that one time I was standing on the side of the road, and a bunch of young paratroopers were going by, you know, and they were hollering and wavering, and they were in the old Class B or khaki uniform, and I can remember seeing the glider patches on their hats and all that stuff. And so then I finally realized what paratroopers was later, and so I said I'd like to be a paratrooper. So when I joined the Army, that's what I wanted to be, was jump out of airplanes. So.
Tell me about.
Fix his jacket. I'm just going to pull this down for you. Just
Okay.
There you go.
Lapel is okay? That's it. Tell me about, how old were you when you first enlisted? Did you enlist, or were you?
Yes, I enlisted in
Tell me
there.
how old you were, where you enlisted.
Just short of my 18th birthday. I'd finished high school, and I went right down, and I finished school in June, and I joined the Army in July of 1956.
And any memories stand out about your early training?
Not really, because I enjoyed it. It was really not a challenge, you know. I mean, I was in good shape physically. I always have been all of my life. And so it was a lot of harassment, hollering, screaming, and making you do push-ups and physical things. But I enjoyed firing the weapons. It was not difficult. And the training was not a challenge at all. I mean, it was a physical challenge it was a challenge to me to see the others suffering, and I was in shape physically and didn't have to suffer as much, you know, and so I would try to assist. I guess you develop a camaraderie among yourselves when you're in a training situation with your buddies to try to help them along, and so that was the most, probably the best part of the training, was trying to assist the weaker ones, you know, in my platoon or in my squad, or when we were on the firing range, firing the weapons or whatever. And that was I kind of catered to the underprivileged, so to speak, whether they're weak physically or whatever. And I think it was because of, again, my childhood, you know, of being poor but not really realizing it, but not being able to eat 3 meals a day and you know, having to eat what we raised or what people gave to us or whatever. So,
Now, what I was reading, you served several tours of duty, and then at some point you decided to go into special forces. Can you talk about
yes,
that?
well, when I went to Vietnam, I was in the 101st Airborne Division, 1st Brigade and 101st Airborne Division. We were stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and we were alerted that they were going to increase the number of troops in Vietnam. And I didn't know much about Vietnam at the time, but I knew we were at war at Vietnam. And so, of course, they passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and you know, they said, okay, we're going to increase the number of troops in Vietnam. And so the brigade that I was in the 101st was alerted, and we went into isolation, and we knew we were going to Vietnam. And so spent 31 days on a ship, and that was an experience, a lifetime experience, 31 days on a ship. And they told us we were going to make a beach landing in Vietnam. So when we finally reached to where we could link up with the troop transports to take us into the beach, we had to offload the ships, you know, amphibious operation. Getting on rope nets down into the troop transport to make the beach landing into Vietnam. And I'll never forget the trip over it was so agonizing because after about 17 days on the ship, we run out of water. And so we started having to take what they call hard water baths out of salt water, you know, and it's had to ration the water and so forth. And it seemed like you couldn't stay clean. You know, you get in the shower and the soap wouldn't lather, and they had about 4,000 of us on a 2,000 troop transport. And so people would get seasick, and they had us all clamored in the bay of the ship, and people were sick all around, and you'd observe that, and you'd get sick. And you had to stand in line all the time to try to get down to eat. You had to eat standing up, you know, in the ship waving. And I was eager to go to war, to get off that ship. But what was so disappointing, after we made the preparations for the amphibious landing, we offloaded and people were falling off the ropes into the China Sea trying to get into the troops transports. We finally get into these transports to transport us to the beach at Cameron Bay, and it's about 2 o'clock in the morning, and everybody's on. We got our weapons loaded and all that stuff. And when the ramp come down on the transport that I was on, the people ahead of me, we were going off and we were being submerged in water. In other words, the water was about 12 feet deep. So when I made my amphibious landing, I come off the end of the troop ship, and I step off and I'm in the water, you know, and I say, I'm gonna drown before I even get on the beach. But there was no firing, and so when we finally got up on the beach, there was nothing. There was nothing. I mean, there was no enemy soldiers, there was no firing, and so we finally moved inland, and then we started getting organized, and half the people dropped their weapons in the water and lost part of their equipment. Thank God, if it had been an enemy there, they'd killed us all, because we were trying to keep them drowned and then getting on the beaches. And then come to find out, we had an infantry division already in place, the 1st Infantry Division, that had secured the beach that we were coming in on. So after we got secure and everything, we went into what we call a base camp and established a beachhead. Well, then all of us were laughing and joking. You know, we made an amphibious landing into nothing. You know, we thought we were going to war, and here we are. You know, we could have just landed on the beaches and everybody could have marched off without going through the water, and we were all kind of frustrated about that. But once we established security and secured the beachhead, then they said, we're going on a search and clear operation. And so to an infantry soldier, you know, I was just a sergeant, a staff sergeant at the time. That meant to me that I had the responsibility of getting my squad ready to do infantry operations. And so it seemed like our mission was to walk around and secure the immediate area we was in, and then we finally got the word, we got to clear this area, secure this area, and then move through the 1st Infantry Division, and then move north and clear an area for the Rock Marines that they're sending in a division from Korea. And we're all saying, for what? There's no war going on here. We haven't made any contact with any enemy. So we didn't get much information down at my level as a sergeant. And so it was kind of like a state of confusion for about, and we continued to do that for about 2 weeks. But then the Viet Cong in that area started harassing us with sporadic mortar attacks. And so then we finally realized, hey, there's an enemy over here and you can get killed, you know, if a mortar happens to hit in your little area. And so we had people shooting each other at night on the perimeter, and a mortar round would go off and it'd start a firefight. And it was really kind of confusing. I was frustrated because it was not what I was trained to do. You know, there was no enemy, I couldn't see the enemy, and we never got any intelligence. And so that was our biggest complaint as non-commissioned officers to the officers, and we had young lieutenants in charge, you know, and they'd tell the captain, okay, the men are frustrated, they want to fight, where's the enemy, let's go find the enemy. But when we started to move north and doing infantry operations, then we started making contact with the enemy force and started the experiencing hasty ambushes, and people were being shot by snipers as we'd move through an area and secure an area. And we started seeing the Vietnamese people in the villages. And then we started getting serious and knew we were at war. And when we finally got up into north, into the Quy Nhon area, I'd been in country at that time in Vietnam, I guess about a month and a half. And we had to clear an area we thought for the Rock Marines, the White Horse Division, which they brought in later. But then they said, no, you got to secure this area, and it was where the last battle, it was where the Viet Minh had defeated the French after the final French force after Dien Bien Phu. And knowing a little bit about military history, I'd read about that, and I knew that we were in that area. And so we shared that down at my level with the soldiers. And we didn't, but the maps didn't seem to correlate with the terrain that we were on. So we were always confused in what area we were in. We really didn't know where we were at. And so my first combat wound was in clearing that area, Quy Nhon. And in fact, we went in and cleared an area and set up a battalion-sized base camp. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, in the company that I was in, we started getting attacked, and the company commander said that we were being attacked by an NVA force, but it was not an NVA force, it was a Viet Cong force. And so I can remember it's dark, and you know, we hastily put up tents, and we didn't put up little pup tents, we put up squad-sized, big-sized tents that they had brought in, they had flown into the area before we got there. And so running around and trying to get a squad of infantry soldiers together with mortar rounds coming in, and it was dark, and we were shooting at each other, and we didn't know who the enemy was at. You know, they were dressed in just fatigues, you know, black uniforms. You couldn't identify them, and so I just got my squad together and tried to get the platoon leader to tell me, what is my mission? You know, we're being attacked, you know, just take and give me a location on the ground and I'll defend that location. Well, he in fact did. My platoon leader says, okay, I want you to move and we'll set up a perimeter in this area. And he says, we just secure this area and stay right here because it's dark, and as long as and I said, it makes sense. So I pulled my squad in, and in the process of securing this piece of ground, well, then I got shot in the face. In fact, I got shot in the face here, and it come out my jaw on the right side. And I can remember, but I don't know who shot me, if it was a enemy soldier or an American soldier, I don't know who shot me. But anyway, the area that we were securing, I didn't realize was a cemetery we were in the middle of a cemetery that was just off of the company area that we were in and had set up to secure for that night as a base camp. And we were in a cemetery, so when I got hit, I can remember I thought my head had been blown off, falling back, and I fell in a grave. And the Vietnamese are buried upright, the Buddhists, and they packed the ground. So when I fell back, what I done, I pushed the mound over, so there is a decaying Vietnamese in that grave, and I can remember the stench and the maggots crawling all over me, and here I am bleeding, and I didn't know if, I finally realized I'd been hit and I was in a grave with another person, you know, and I was partially upright in this grave. And you know, as I moved around, the decaying body, I was getting it all over me, and it made me sick. So I got sick, and that hurt worse than being shot in the face. And I can remember the pain and trying to feel, but I was afraid to touch myself because I realized that I was laying on top of a decaying body that was partially upright. And my face was bleeding, and I didn't know if I'd lost part of my face, and I didn't want to touch it because I knew there was maggots all in that body, you know, and so it was scary. So I had to stay that way about 3 hours. So I just decided to stop moving until daylight, and maybe somebody will see me and treat me, you know. And so finally it got daylight enough, and the company commander was making an assessment of the company, and he found me, and I was just like I learned to do that, and thank God, you know, I can just stay in one area forever and not move. And so that's what I'd done for about 3 hours. And so they finally realized that I wasn't dead, that I was alive. And so they evacuated me. They got some medics over there and started treating me. And I ended up in the hospital in Quin Yon, which was, they had a field evacuation hospital there. And in the process of going through the evacuation of being treated for the wound, I realized my wound wasn't that bad. I had in fact been shot by an AK-47 or SWS, which is a 7.62 millimeter rifle. And the ammunition or something is not as powerful as we had AR-15s at that time. And so the round that went in my face lodged in my jaw and come out my jaw, but apparently it didn't do as much. It just destroyed some teeth that I had on the lower and upper part and went through my face. And so they did reconstruct a part of my face, but they salvaged my jaw at that time. And so while I was in the hospital being treated for the wound, there was a special forces guy in a bunk next to me, which I later got to be friends with and was friends with for 40 years before he died, or 30 years before he died. And so anyway, his battalion commander or group commander, a colonel named McKean that was in charge of special forces operations in Korea, come to the hospital to visit with him. And so while he was visiting with him, well, then the sergeant told him, said, well, there's Sergeant Howard. He's out of the 101st, and he got shot at Quin Yon. Said, we need a guy like him in Special Forces. And I said, my God, if I can get out of the 101st and get into some unit that's organized, I'd really like to. And that's just what I told the colonel. I said, you know, I can train, I can fight, and we're a little bit disorganized. We don't know what we're doing. So if you got a job for an infantry sergeant, I'll volunteer for it. And he, in fact, took my name. And so I was, about another week, they said, okay, it's clear for you to go back to the unit. And so when I got back to my unit in the 101st, which they loaded us up on 2.5-ton trucks and took us back to the unit, I was still all bandaged up, and I reported in to my first sergeant. He said, you've been transferred to Special Forces. Said, you got to go to Saigon, you're going on a special mission. I said, what do you mean? He said, oh, you got to have a top secret clearance, and you've been selected to be in Special Forces. And I said, okay. He said, how did they pick your name? I said, I don't know. I didn't tell him the story about talking to the colonel that come to visit the sergeant. And so anyway, they make a long story short, they sent me to Saigon, and I had to report in to MACV headquarters. And so I went in for an interview, and they asked me to give them all my personal background, and they explained to me that I'd be involved in special operations. And I didn't know, but you know, I didn't know what special operations was at that time, other than I knew it was special. It was different than the normal infantry operations, and so, and I knew you had to have a secret clearance or a top secret clearance to do it, and so they were saying you need a top secret clearance. They were giving us lie detector tests. I was with a group of other sergeants that had been selected. And so,
Can I give you a glass of water?
yes, yeah.
Is it a-
Well, I was going to get to that, but that didn't come till much later. My training was really on the battlefield, on the ground in Vietnam, until I finished my first tour, and then they sent me back to Special Forces training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. But after I was selected, went through this selection process in Saigon, well, then they assigned me down in the train, which was the headquarters for Special Forces in Vietnam. And then I was put into a B-52, which they were special. They run special missions in South Vietnam. And actually we run small unit operations, and we went into areas and sought the enemy, and it was the guerrilla, the Viet Cong, out in these areas and would destroy their base camps or capture them and stuff. So I finished that tour, and at the end of 12 months, well, then I was rotated back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and that's when I went through Special Forces training at Camp McCall, South Carolina, and was trained in Special Forces. They had a 7-week Special Forces enlisted course, and then once we finished that 7-week course, the emphasis was on demolitions and training, small unit patrolling, and shooting weapons and setting up hasty ambushes, small unit operations. Then we went into Phase 2 Special Forces training. I was trained as a weapons man or a demolition man. And so that was an 8-week block of instruction following that. And then after you finished the second phase of Special Forces training, then you gathered back up with a team, and we had another 8-week block of instruction on unconventional warfare and guerrilla operations. And so you actually linked up with a team and trained, and they dropped you into North Carolina, in the northern part of North Carolina. You'd link up with the civilians, the partisan forces, and conduct small unit operations against organized Army units that were actually securing the area. So then once I got qualified as a Special Forces sergeant, then I was assigned to a team at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. But I had never served on a team in the States, because when I finished training, they said, you're going back to Vietnam. So when they sent me back to Vietnam and hadn't been selected for special operations training and having served in B-52, they said, we're going to assign you to MAC-V-SARG, or at that time, later was called MAC-V-SARG, was called Command and Control Central, or Forward Operational Base Number 2. And that was in 2 Corps in the Central Highlands, and we had the mission of going into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and capturing prisoners and destroying enemy locations as they moved south into Vietnam. So I was assigned to a team at Kontum, and we just went into Laos and Cambodia mostly. I went into North Vietnam a few times, but we would go out on team missions, and our mission was to seek the enemy out and destroy him in his own territory as he moved south.
No, how many people are, what time frame are we talking about here?
We're talking about, well, when I first went to Vietnam, it was 1965, and I left and I went back again in 1966 when I finished Special Forces training. So 1966, 65 through 67 time frame I'm talking about now.
And how many people are part of your team? And was it the same team? You were with?
No, different size teams, okay. A normal Special Forces team is 10 people, okay. You got by MOS, Military Occupational Specialty. And so I was a weapons and a demolition expert by the time I finished Special Forces training. And when I got back to Vietnam on special operation, the team would vary based on the indigenous personnel assigned to the team and where you were going, normally 6 to 8 man teams. So normally no more than 6 man teams. So our mission was to go into Laos and locate the enemy, and most of the time we didn't have any intelligence because they were always moving, and they were moving into South Vietnam, and to interdict and destroy the enemy. And so that was kind of my orientation, was to go in and locate them, record the information and gather the information, capture prisoners and bring them back south, and then turn them over to MACV headquarters for interrogation on the prisoner side of the house, or to provide human intelligence so that the conventional forces in the South could use that as human intelligence to plan in the areas that they were operating in. So that was my mission in Vietnam. And so I stayed there from 1967 all the way up until, I stayed 18 months on my second tour, and then I got shot up real bad in November of 1967. And they had to send me back, and I went to Japan to the hospital, and then ended up back at Fort Bragg, North Carolina in the 6th Special Forces Group. And I stayed there for 3 months and recovered, and then they sent me back to Vietnam. And so when I went back to Vietnam again, all Special Forces people in Vietnam did not work in special operations. They had their in-country operations where they worked with the South Vietnamese and the irregular forces with regular Special Forces team missions. But out of the Special Forces that had served in Special Operations Group, which was controlled by MACV headquarters, we still continued to run operations into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So when I went back again in 1968, I was assigned to Special Operations Group again, and I was sent back to Kontum because I was familiar with the target areas that we went into. So again, I just run small unit operations in Laos and Cambodia and North Vietnam.
Let's talk about the mission for which you received the medal. Tell me about when that was, where you were in Vietnam, what was your mission?
We're going to change tape.
Water?
No, I'm fine. I'm a little bit tired. I know I'm not doing well. But anyway, if you want to know about the mission that I received the Medal of Honor for, I was...
Hold on one second, we're always ready.
They have to-
We gotta put
Yeah,
call
tell me,
bars down.
we'll have you start, just tell me where it was, how long you've been in Vietnam at that point.
Okay.
Okay, and anytime you're ready, Karen.
I was the first sergeant of the reconnaissance company at Kontum, and that's where we were headquartered for Forward Operational Group 2. And we had sent a team into Laos, and they went in to locate an enemy force that we had been watching for a number of days. And they had reported that they were surrounded by the enemy force, and that they broke radio silence. You normally wouldn't break communication silence, because they were surrounded, and they said they were being captured. They were surrounded and there was nothing they could do. And so the colonel in charge of the operation got with me, and he said, "Bob, I want you to take a team in and get those people back." And I said, "Okay." And so he got with a lieutenant there, and we put together a large size, reinforced platoon size operation. And they got the helicopter support to take us in, and we went in to recover a team of 6 people that had been captured by the North Vietnamese, not by the Pathet Lao or the irregular forces in the area. And so we staged what assets we had left at Kontum at that time, and so I was a senior non-commissioned officer with the most experience, combat experience, and so in the Army you got to have an officer in charge. And so the colonel come to me and told him, I'm going to send Lieutenant Sheridan in, but I want you to give him your assistance and make sure we bring those Americans back. And I said, yes, sir. So that, in fact, we staged our forces and went into Dokto, and they got the helicopter support, and they took us into Laos. And going into the area, we were trying to get into the area where they last communicated from. And in the process of doing that, we started receiving a lot of ground fire because we were on 6 helicopters on the insert. And as we went into the landing zone, a couple of the helicopters got shot up pretty bad and they had to land pretty quickly. And so we were taking casualties on the insert into the landing zone. And we finally got in on the ground, and I got with a lieutenant, and he says, Bob, we need to secure this LZ, and I want you to get a couple of men and secure the exterior of the LZ, and we need to organize and get off the LZ and move toward our target area. And so in the process of, I've got 3 people together, and we started moving off the LZ, and all I wanted to do was just secure the exterior of the LZ. And moving around the LZ, we run into all kind of enemy soldiers. We had to fight our way off the drop zone. I can remember in one action, here's a platoon of NVA soldiers coming toward me, and I got 3 men behind me, and I can remember being fired at, and I fell backwards, and they killed 3 men behind me, and I'm firing and killing the North Vietnamese that's trying to kill us. And so I finally said, there's no way we're going to secure this LZ. So I made my way back to the lieutenant after finding out that I just got 2 people killed, or 3 people that was with me, and told him that the LZ was completely surrounded. And by that time, one of the helicopters had been shot down with some of the troops on it that we were trying to get into the LZ. It was almost a nightmare. So he said, well, let's reconstitute. And he was on the radio. I wasn't on the radio. And he was telling we had a FAC, a forward air controller, above us, and he was telling him, keeping him updated on our situation on the ground. And they were reporting it back to our higher headquarters. And I think he was requesting to terminate the mission. But they couldn't terminate the mission because they couldn't get any ships back in to get us out. So realizing that, we finally reconstituted our forces, and we just fought our way off the drop zone. And we left a helicopter behind with dead people on the drop zone, and we started moving toward where we had last, or we thought where we might find some of the remains or some of the soldiers that we were looking for. And so in the process of doing that, I think we had 28 people left at that time, and I was responsible for bringing up real security as a platoon moved forward. And so the lieutenant was up front, and we were moving toward the high ground, and we were still receiving sporadic fire on our flanks. And so I made my way up toward the front of the platoon to tell the lieutenant that we should reconsider what we were doing and try to just organize our troops and get a better plan together, or we were all going to get killed, because the enemy knew where we were at and they were following us, and we were all going to end up captured ourselves. And just as I made myself up toward the front trying to get close to the lieutenant, we were ambushed. Sure enough, we walked right into an ambush. And so when I come to, I was blown up in a crump on the ground, and my weapon was blown out of my hand. And I can remember seeing red and saying a prayer, hoping I wasn't blind. I couldn't see. And I knew I was in a lot of pain, and my hands were hurting. And I don't know, I just had so much pain, and I was laying in a crump on the ground, and I realized that I couldn't get up. And I really didn't want to get up anyway because I couldn't see. And then I finally started getting a vision back, and it was like blood was in my eyes, and I started feeling, but my hands were all blown up and burned up, and my weapon was blown out of my hand. part of my web gear was blown off, and I was blown up in the front part of my legs was blown up, and I couldn't stand up, so I didn't know if I could be able to walk, and there was firing all around. And then it was like there was a big flame, and there was smoke, and there were people screaming and hollering, and it in fact was an enemy soldier that were burning the people that had been ambushed with a flamethrower. And so, and finally I was able to see, and all I was thinking was, I knew I was hurt. I was going to blow myself up. I didn't want to be alive and be burned alive, and so I was trying to get a grenade off to blow myself up. And the guy walked up to me and was getting ready to burn me, and he looked at me, and by that time, my web gear was blown away from me. I was able to I had a grenade pinned on the upper part of my web gear. I was able to get that grenade off, but I couldn't get a hold of the pin. I couldn't hold it. I was trying to hold it with both hands. And so I was going to bite and just pull that pin out, because my first thought was to blow myself up. And then I finally realized if I blow myself up, I'll blow him up too. So my intent was to do that. And so even though my hands were blown up, they look pretty normal now, but my fingers on this hand were hanging down. These two fingers here, they pieced them back together, and my thumb. I got the pin out of that grenade, and this guy is standing there about 4 inches from here, the guy with the camera. And he's looking at me, and he's got that flamethrower, and he just burned a bunch of people that was in the kill zone. He didn't burn the lieutenant. The lieutenant was about 5 feet away from me, and he was laying face forward, and he was hollering, he was screaming. I knew he was hurt, and I realized that he was hurt. And the guy looked at me with the flamethrower, and then I looked at him, and I guess I looked so bad and pitiful, he decided not to burn me up. He just turned and walked off. So here I am with a grenade that might go off. All I got to do is throw it. So, he had just turned and walked off, but there's dead people laying there burning, and I didn't want to throw the grenade, so I'm stuck with the grenade with the pin out, and I knew I couldn't get the pin back in it. So I just kind of looked around and found a clear area and kind of threw the grenade off, and the grenade went off over here, but the guy with the flamethrower was still going away from me in that direction. And then I crawled forward and got a hold of the Lieutenant Sheridan and started pulling him backwards, because I couldn't get up, and started pulling him backwards, and I just pulled him back down the hill as far as I could, and I'm pulling this guy, and he was a tall guy, about 6'4" and weighed about 200 pounds. And my hands were hurting and bleeding, and I was bleeding all over, but I was able to pull him. And I was trying to talk to him and tell him to hold on, he's still alive. So I'm pulling him back down the hill, and there was a sergeant that was laying down behind a log with a weapon that hadn't been wounded, had seen this, but he was crying and not using his weapon. And so I get up against this log, and I'm pulling the lieutenant, and I'm screaming at him, help me get the lieutenant, come on, help me get the lieutenant. But he wouldn't move. He was just laying there crying, leaning and crying, and his weapon, he was laying down. And so I said, well, and I get mad, so I said, give me the weapon, but I'm trying to get the weapon. And I actually reached trying to take his weapon away from him to get him to help me take the lieutenant back down the hill. And it was a slight, it wasn't really a great, it just, I was going down, in other words, okay? We were going partially up a hill. And so in the process of doing that, well, then he wanted to move away from me, and here I am begging him to help me because I can't walk to drag the lieutenant back down. And so the guy is still alive today and never spoke to me since then. But anyway, so I said, well, give me your weapon. And he wouldn't give me his weapon, but he did give me a .45. And so 45, that was his handgun, and he had a holster on his upper web gear, and he pulled his .45 out and gave it to me. And I said, I need some magazines for it, because there's 7 rounds in a .45. And so just as he gave me the .45, and I'm trying to tell him to give me a couple of more magazines of rounds for it, because I knew there was a lot of enemy around us, but they hadn't attacked us yet. a bunch of enemy soldiers come running towards. So here I am trying to fire the handgun, and I can remember shooting this enemy soldier that was fixing to stick me with a bayonet. He's running toward me. In fact, he fell across the lieutenant that I was dragging. And so just as he fell across, there was another one behind him. They were trying to get us alive is what they were trying to do. Well, then this sergeant that I was arguing, almost fighting with, got up and started firing his weapon and started killing the enemy soldiers. And actually, at that time, I got hit again, and with my web gear, and I'm partially upright. And the only thing that saved my life was I had magazines in my magazine pouches on my web gear. And this enemy soldier, I guess I must have been hit by about 15 or 20 rounds because it hit the magazines and my magazines exploded in my ammo pouch. And so I'm being blown up and then off to the side. And here I am, think I'm blown up again. And I'm still alive, and a lieutenant's laying this time about 10 or 15 feet from me. And so by the time I sorted myself out and realized I could still move around, I started crawling back toward the lieutenant to get a hold of him. And the sergeant was running around fighting, and there were other soldiers back behind him and I hadn't been hurt at all that had been watching us being, you know, almost executed by the enemy and not doing anything, not even firing their weapons. And so the sergeant finally, as I crawled back toward the lieutenant, he got to the lieutenant first, and then he drugged the lieutenant over to me again, and I said, well, I can't get him any further. You know, I'm really hurt. I said, you know, at this time, when I was blown up at this time, it tore part of my leg out right in my thigh right here. And so, and I knew that I was bleeding. I could see all the blood and stuff. And so, anyway, the sergeant just grabbed the lieutenant, and he was upright, and he was trying to run, and he was grabbing the lieutenant, and his head was bouncing on, and he was hit in the upper part of his body, and he's bleeding, blood running out of his mouth, and here I am trying to help and get a hold, and he's dragging the poor lieutenant, and he's almost dragging his head off. And so I'm finding myself mad again because I know there's 4 or 5 people back here that hadn't been shot at all that could have come up and helped us. They were just fear, you know. They were not afraid to fight. I mean, afraid to get into the fight. And so in the process of doing that, the sergeant and myself finally got down, and there's a Vietnamese officer that was with us in this platoon, and he was a Vietnamese Special Forces officer. And I was trying to talk to him, and then he come over and tried to help me, but he got shot. We got attacked again by 3 or 4 enemy, and so here I am again trying to shoot that 45. Even though I'd blown over, I still had that 45 and trying to hold on to that. And I tried to use the 45 again, and so I think I might have shot one more, but then I was out of ammo, and I didn't have any more ammo for the 45, and it got kind of confusing for that point. The next thing I remember, I was in and out, was I was down at the bottom of the hill, and there was a sergeant named Brown who got shot up pretty bad, but he come over to me, and I said, is the lieutenant still alive? And he said, yes. He said, we've got him down. He said, I've got an IV in him, but I don't think he's going to make it. I said, make him make it. I said, you keep that lieutenant alive. And so there was 3 other sergeants with him, and so they had an IV in him, and I said, let's set up a quick perimeter right here. We're not moving anymore, and I want you to get every live person that we've got that's able to fight. I want to talk to them right now. And so he kind of propped me up, and I said, I need a radio. And so I said, we're going to establish a perimeter right here, and you're going to fight or die. Now, I'm going to give you, I'm going to shoot you. And I said, I want a weapon. And so we set up a little perimeter right there. And so once they got me a radio and I started talking to our fact, I explained to him, I said, I got a bunch of people down here that's scared to death, but I got 2 people I know that's capable of fighting, but I don't know what the enemy situation is. There's a lot of them. And I said, I'm going to set up a perimeter right here. And it was getting dark. And he says, well, you're going to have to do something. I said, do you have any strobe lights? And a strobe light is a blinking light that you can put out to where they can identify you on the ground. And so I was able to, I didn't have any, my equipment had been blown up at that time, but I was able to locate, and I think I had about 8 or 10 indigenous people and 3 Americans left. I was able to locate 3 strobe lights. And so I told the medic sergeant, I said, I want those strobe lights put out in a triangle to where they can see us, and maybe we can call in air support around our position. And so that's what we in fact did. And so they propped me up in the center and set up a perimeter and put the strobe lights out. And once the FAC located the strobe lights, he said, I've got your strobe lights. And he says, I'm going to call Moonbeam, which was a C-119 with 20 millimeter cannons mounted on it. He says, we're going to call them in and they're going to put fire around your position so that we can possibly identify, and started bringing in air support to suppress the enemy around you, and we'll get you through the night. And he says, I want you to know, and we used code names at that time, and General Singlov was my commander. He was a colonel at that time who later retired from the Army. And his code name, and they give me his code name, says that we'll get you out. And so once they brought the C-119 in and started putting fire around our position, then they started asking me, is it effective? Has the enemy attacked your position yet? And I told him, I can't see the enemy, but we're receiving a lot of small arm fire as long as, but what happened when we went back down this hill, when we got down and set up this perimeter, by the grace of God, there was a tributary running off a creek, and I can kind of give you an example. We come down off the high ground, and there's a tributary here, and we're right down at the point of where we had come off of this hill, and the enemy was here, and so they had to come across that little tributary to get to our position to fight. And I finally realized that after we set up a hasty defense. And so then in my own mind, I said, they will attack us, but as long as we got that water obstacle between us and the enemy, and we can keep the Air Force putting fire around our position, we'll be okay. Now, the citation that you read on my citation for the Medal of Honor doesn't even reflect what I'm saying or what I've told you up to this point. Because even though it's got 11 witnesses on it, only 3 of those witnesses were actually on the ground. They were on the radio in the air somewhere on this operation, and so it won't correlate with what's in that citation. But anyway, in the process of us defending that position and the enemy trying to get into our position, the fire became very intense. But we were not receiving any casualties. And I don't even know how many people I had in that little perimeter there. I know how many I got out, but I don't know how many people I had left. At that time, I think there might have been 12 of us left. And so they kept probing our position, and we kept receiving enemy fire, and all I would do was relay the location from my position, and the people overhead in the aircraft could see the strobe lights and where the enemy was located. But there was also the air support over us, which was the forward air controller and a small aircraft. And the aircraft that was putting the fire, the 20 millimeter fire around our position, could identify the enemy location because they were trying to shoot down both those aircraft flying over us. And I finally said, well, you know, I don't have a weapon and I can't use a weapon, so, you know, we're not going to make it through the night. And I remember, you know, jokingly telling the forward air controller, if you've got a weapon up there, if you could throw it out the window of your aircraft, I'd appreciate it, you know. And he kept talking to me, a great guy, an Air Force captain, and saying, we're going to get you out, don't you worry, we'll get you a weapon. And so finally, one of the strobe lights, this is about 4 hours later, one of the strobe lights went out because those strobe lights only have a life of maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, but this was about 4 hours later, and all the strobe lights are going out. And I realized it, and they realized it, and it was about 6 more hours to daylight. But my headquarters had a bunch of aviators out of Playcool that had agreed they only had 20 minutes on station from our launch point at Dock Toll to where they could get to my location. They would have 20 minutes on station and they could load us up and get us back to Dock Toll so they could get us back to the hospital. And even though it was dark, they agreed to do that. And that's the first time, I think, historically, in special operations, that you had a bunch of aviators that were willing to die to come in and get us. And I was told this later. I wasn't told this at the time. I was told that they had volunteers that were going to come and get us. And in the process of holding the position until we could get aircraft in to land to get my wounded and those that were killed that we were able to get out, I finally was told we got aircraft inbound. They only got a few minutes on station. We're going to have to replace the C-119, and they had replaced it 3 times over a period of about, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours. And they had to do it just prior to the helicopters getting on station so they could provide support for the helicopters to come in and get us. And the helicopters were inbound, and they were going to replace Moonbeam. That was the aircraft that was providing the ground support for us. And so I alerted this medic again was my link with communicating everybody. I couldn't move around. I crawled around and got a good feel of how our perimeter was set up. But then the enemy, I think, when they had a lull in battle, when the Air Force decided to pull the C-119 off to go back and replace it again, every time they'd do that, they would hit us with a ground attack. And so the enemy was pretty intense at this time, and so I told them, you know, you're going to have to bring it right in on our position, just kill us. Kill us and the enemy, because I don't want to be captured. I don't want to blow my own self up, just bring it in. They brought the fire in on our position. In fact, I remember being, you know, fire being landing right between my feet and, you know, ricochets hitting me in the face. You know, that's how intense it was. And then all at once, they had replaced the aircraft, and here are the helicopters coming in, and I'm still communicating with this sergeant. I said, you know, we might get out of here alive yet. And so, you know, everybody was so thrilled that they had helicopters coming in, but I said, I don't know if they're going to be able to get in here, because when they start bringing those helicopters in, the enemy is going to try to shoot the helicopters down if they even get in, and we might not be successful. But by golly, I'll never forget, the helicopter was inbound, and the FAC overhead said, I got one. The ground fire is intense, but I think he's going to be able to get in. Said, can you get people together on the first load? And I said, I'd like to get everybody that I've got that's killed. I had about 7 or 8 soldiers that were dead that was in the indigenous force, and a few Americans that were with me. And so I said, I'd like to get all the, and that's not normal policy. You try to get everybody alive and wounded out first, and then if you got room, get the dead people out, because they're dead. There's nothing you can do for them. And anyway, I said, I'd like to get all the dead out first, and then I'll get the wounded out. And so I got all the dead people that I could count. I think I had 11 dead, and I said, I'd like to put them on the first helicopter. They didn't agree with that, but I said, that's the way they're going to do it. And so we got all the dead. And I can remember the helicopter landing, and I thought it was only about 20 meters from me, but it seemed like a football field away by the time I was dragging this dead soldier over there to get him on the aircraft, and the crew running off the aircraft to help us. And we get all the dead that we had in the perimeter on that one helicopter. And just as the helicopter takes off, 2 of them fall off. And I can remember realizing that they're falling, the ones that we just got on the helicopter, and the helicopter having to take off, fell off. So this medic sergeant that I was with, he realized it too, and I said, we got to get over and get them back on the helicopter. The helicopter continued to take off though, and they got another helicopter in. We were able to get the 2 that had fell off the helicopter with us. And so once I was convinced we had everybody that we could get on that helicopter, Well, then, if there was room, I'd get on the helicopter, but there wasn't room. I got some more dead people on the helicopter and wounded people, and then the helicopter took off, and then they finally got another helicopter in, and so there was 3 of us left on the ground. And I can remember the crew coming off the helicopter, and I'm sitting there leaning up against this dead soldier, and I said, would you check around and see if there's any more dead that you can find, anybody alive in this area? But it was still dark and you couldn't see, and so they were convinced that we were only 2 left, and so we finally got on the helicopter. And the dead soldier that I was next to was a lieutenant that I had drugged down the hill. He had finally died. And so he was also one of the ones that had fell off the helicopter that took off initially. And so he ended up back on the ground. And that hurt me worse than being shot up, seeing that lieutenant die. And so they finally got us on the helicopter. And I was so mad, and years later I met this pilot, and I didn't even appreciate him sacrificing his life to come in to get us. I remember him reaching over, and I'm holding a lieutenant, and I'm not one about crying, but I was emotional at that time, and I was crying because this lieutenant was dead. And I'm holding on to him, and I can remember this guy, and they had just got me, helped me in the aircraft, and he reached around over his seat and grabbed me, and I remember being so mad, I just pushed his arm away, and I'm trying to hold the lieutenant, you know, because, you know, here's a great young kid. And so, and then from that point, they got us back to a field evacuation hospital in Pleiku. And then the next thing I know, I'm in the hospital in Pleiku, and that's all I remember about the accident I got the Medal of Honor for. So that's my story about the Medal of Honor.
How many people did you go in with that day?
Okay, see, the total number was 37 that we went in. The total number was 37. But actually, out of the 37, there was only live ones left. When we got back, it was all shot up. There was only 6 of us. And so that was the way it happened.
I gotta change tape.
The forward air controller that had responsibility of coordinating the air support that we were getting on the ground, yes.
But you had said just, you know, kill us.
Yes.
But then you said you realized you might get out of there. What happened that made you realize you might get out?
The helicopter made it, you know, realize that we might get out of there alive, you know. And the sergeant that was with me, that I remember, Sergeant Brown, the medic, was so great. He should have been, if anybody should have got the Medal of Honor, he should have got the Medal of Honor.
Can you
Because,
tell that again, the sergeant?
pardon?
Who was that you were talking?
The medic sergeant that I told you that was with me on the operation. So, but anyway, I ended up in the hospital after that for quite a while, and before I went back to the unit, and they told me that I was nominated for the Medal of Honor. Now, there's a guy that's still living that's one of the witnesses on that, on my Medal of Honor, the company commander of the unit at that time. His name is Ed Lassane, and he's in Panama. He's retired, and he's got a diving school in Panama. So a lot of what I'm telling you was in and out, but I don't remember the details on it. I was told later by people that were actually in there, back in the headquarters that was running the operation. And I don't apologize for that. I just don't remember it being that way, you know. And so when I read the citation, I've always felt bad about it because that's not the way it happened. And so I always tell you what I know about the action, okay? And so that's the only way I can do it.
When did you find out that you were nominated or you were going to receive the medal, and what was your reaction?
Well, when they told me I was nominated, number one, the Medal of Honor, I'd heard about it and I knew what it meant, but it didn't mean anything to me. And I didn't think, with my background as a sergeant, that I would ever get the Medal of Honor. You know, that was kind of restricted in my mind at that time for, you know, officers and senior non-commissioned officers that were really outstanding, and I didn't consider myself worthy of that distinction of earning the Medal of Honor. And so when I was told about it, of course I was privileged and kind of felt good that I was nominated for it. But in a way I felt bad because I didn't feel that I was worthy of the Medal of Honor for that action, because I was not successful in, number one, doing what the colonel had directed me to do, and that was to find that team that had been surrounded and been captured or killed by the enemy. And later I found that part of them did live and were in captivity and are killed, okay? And so we didn't accomplish our mission. And number two, I felt bad about that because I had a bunch of people that were not willing to fight with me, and I saw cowardice at its worst on a battlefield by a sergeant laying there crying, and other people that watched us getting killed and were not able to muster enough intestinal fortitude to move forward to fight. And so what I wanted to do was to, and that's kind of the way I survived, and not only that battle, but a lot of other battles. Because even though you're wounded and shot up, as long as you can move around, you can survive in war. And so I benefited from that action, but earning the Medal of Honor, I'm very thankful that I was awarded that, but I felt kind of guilty about that. I really did. But now, later in my military service, I used those experiences to try to train soldiers that I was responsible for so that they could perform on a battlefield and not be afraid of the enemy and still function. And I think I was successful in doing that. So that action in itself helped me later in my military career. So, yes.
When did you receive the medal? Can you tell me about the...
Now,
who was with
on
you?
March the 2nd, 1971, again, I was in Vietnam, serving in Vietnam, and the camp that I was in, the same camp that I was in when I was nominated for the Medal of Honor, I was an officer. I'd been commissioned. And so I was a captain in charge of the company, and the company had 218 Americans in it, and we had them broken down into teams of 6 to 8 man teams, and I was a company commander, and this was at Kon and we were under attack. The North Vietnamese soldiers were moving in to South Vietnam, and they were going to take the city of Kon Tum. And so the camp that I was in was just across the Doc Blah River, and they had mortared our camp, and we were under mortar attack, and I was getting a perimeter set up, and one of the non-commissioned officers in the TOC run and said, you know, we got General Westmoreland on the 314, that's the field telephone, he wants to talk to you. General Westmoreland was in Washington, D.C. as Chief of Staff of the Army. And I said, well, what does he want to talk to me for? He says, he's got a special message for you. So I finally made it back to the TOC, our Tactical Operations Center, and the general was on the telephone, and he says, Bob, congratulations, I've just been told that you're going to receive the Medal of Honor, and you are to be in Washington, D.C. on February the 27th. And I said, well, General, I don't think that's possible. We got the enemy got us surrounded. He said, I hear you guys in a little trouble over there, but he says, I've got a hold of General Abrams, and he's going to get you out of there. And I said, well, he's going to have to hurry up because the mortar rounds are coming in pretty heavy over here. And so he said, well, we'll get the 4th Infantry Division down there and we'll get you out. And I said, okay. And so I turned to this colonel that was in charge, and I said, the general wants to talk to you. So I put the colonel on the telephone, and so after he finished with the general, he told me, he says, I don't want you going back out on the perimeter. I want you to stay right here. And he says, we're going to get the airfield secured, and we're going to fly you out of here. And I said, I got a damn company out of here, Colonel. We got the enemy's going to maybe attack the camp. Somebody needs to be in charge of it. And he said, I'll take care of that. But anyway, I went out with him, and we secured our perimeter, and the mortar rounds kept coming in. And this was like about 12 o'clock at night or 1 o'clock in the morning. And finally, the next morning at daylight, the colonel come over and told me, he says, they're going to land General Abrams' aircraft at Khartoum. He said they got the airfield secured and they're going to fly you back to Saigon. And he said, but we got a problem. He said, the enemy is between here and the airfield. And he says, I'm going to put a team with you and we're going to put you on a truck and we'll get you to the airfield. Well, in the process of we almost didn't make it to the airfield. So we left the camp on a 2.5-ton truck. And so we're going down across the bridge, and the enemy had secured the bridge over the Dakbla River. And so the sergeant driving the truck said he didn't care. I said, I don't care. I said, just drive through, you know, we'll just see if we can get the truck across. And that's what we did, you know. And so they were firing at us, and we finally got across the bridge. But once we got across the bridge, we had about 3 miles to go to the airfield, and we didn't realize how many enemy soldiers were in Khartoum. And so, you know, we're receiving fire, but nobody's been shot up or anything. And so we finally got shot at quite a bit. They tried to, you know, shoot us up on the truck. And we finally got to the airfield, but, you know, I said, well, what time is the aircraft going to get here? You know, we made contact with a unit out of the 4th Infantry Division that had the airfield secure. And they had communication with the aircraft that was coming in their headquarters. And so finally they landed this, it was a C-12, General Abrams aircraft. And so the truck that I was on, this 2.5-ton truck, drove me out to the airfield, and here's these 2 colonels coming off this airplane. Says, are you Captain Howard? I said, yeah. He says, we got to get you back to Saigon. So I get on the aircraft, and I can remember taking off and looking out there, soldiers running everywhere, and there's North Vietnamese soldiers everywhere in Khartoum running around shooting. And I'm saying, you know, is this really happening to me? I can't believe this is happening to me. And so they flew me back into Saigon, and so they landed at Tan Son Nhut, and so here's another bunch of colonels coming out, said, we're going to take you over to a trailer next to General Abrams, and said, we got to get you cleaned up, and you're going to be flying out of here in a couple of days going back to Washington. And I think this was like February the 24th or something like that. And actually, when I got to the trailer that they were going to put me in, they had a colonel escort me, and they took me in the trailer and told me to take a shower, and he says, we got to get you measured for a uniform and get you in a Class A uniform and all that stuff. I said, I don't have anything. You know, I didn't have any, when I left on that truck, you know, I didn't take anything with me but just the uniform I had on. And so I said, I need a shaving kit, I need a toothbrush and all that stuff. And so I got sick. I got real sick. And the reason I got sick, I just couldn't believe what was happening to me, and I didn't want to leave and go back to Washington and receive a medal. And here I am, the company commander of a company that's being attacked by the enemy force. And so I really got sick. And so in the process of trying to get me some uniforms to wear, they told me that General Abrams was going to have all the officers in Vietnam in a special dinner for me that night. And so I told this colonel, I don't want a dinner. And if you're going to take me back to Washington, let's go as soon as you can. But do give me a chance to get a proper uniform before I go back. And so he said, well, they got this dinner planned tonight, and they got a new laundered pair of fatigues for me, and got some captain bars sewed on it and all that stuff. And so I can remember being sick, and I took a shower and everything, and then laying around on this bunk, and they had coffee and all that stuff in there, and waiting around until the dinner that night. And so I can remember, well, I don't like this General Abrams anyway. He didn't like special forces. It was known in Vietnam. And so what am I doing going in and all these generals and stuff like that, you know, in air-conditioned trailers, and I'd been fighting the enemy. And so, but anyway, he was a very pleasant fella. He met me about an hour before we had this dinner, and you know, he was very cordial. And I got to know him later on. He was a very good man, and he kind of hugged me and said I set a good example for all the officers and soldiers in Vietnam. And he wanted me to meet his staff, and the dinner was in my honor, not his honor. And I told him I appreciated that, but I was sick and I didn't feel much like eating. And so, well, he said, you just do what you want to do, but you're going to be there. And I said, yes, sir. And so that night, I had all the major commanders in Vietnam, and he made this announcement. And he went back and he talked a little bit about me. Of course, he knew more about me than I knew about myself. And he talked about all of my service in Vietnam and how I had received a direct appointment and was now an officer, an infantry officer on the ground, and the way that I was determined to fight the enemy. And I felt kind of good the way, in fact, I'd have felt better if he'd have presented me the Medal of Honor. But anyway, so to make a long story short, they took me to Tant Sanut, and I said, am I going back in fatigues, or are they going to get me a Class A uniform? They said, we'll get all that squared away. We'll land in Oakland, and you'll get uniforms issued to you and all that stuff. And it all worked. You know, I can remember I was so sick, I was sick all the way back. They took me to camp, they flew me out of Tant Sanut, and I can remember being sick, and it was a Continental Airlines, and these hostesses on that airline was so nice, and I was riding in the first class area, and I was sick, and it was full of soldiers, and I was vomiting all the way, and I mean, I was really sick. And so when I landed in Oakland, I can remember being so glad to get off that plane, and I had another host of people to meet me there, and I was so sick I couldn't hardly walk. And then I don't even hardly remember getting in a van, and they took me somewhere, and then they made sure that they give me a khaki uniform, and it was pressed and all that stuff. And so I didn't have medals to put on. I didn't have all the medals, so they just put me in a khaki uniform. And they said, we're going to fly you into Washington. And so then there's another agonizing flight to Washington, D.C., and I get into Washington, D.C., and I remember getting off the plane at the airport, and a bunch of people there to meet me and all that stuff. And I was married at the time, and my wife back in Temple, Texas, and my two daughters were already moved to Washington to be there to meet me. And so I can remember getting off the plane in Washington, and there's my two daughters and my wife there to meet me, and I hadn't even seen my youngest daughter. And you know, here she is, a lovely young lady. And so anyway, you got all these people, and they took us to the Custer Hotel downtown Washington, D.C. And I got a colonel escort, and they take us up to this suite, and they tell us, you know, you'll be in this suite, but you can't eat here. You can't have any room service. Don't use room service because we can't pay for it. So you have to go down to eat, and I've been sick, and so, you know, my wife is all confused, and they're so thrilled, and she had her aunt with her who was like my mother, a wonderful woman, and so they were worried about me being sick, and so we finally went down and sat down and eat and got relaxed. And then I can remember this colonel coming back to the room and saying, Bob, we got a problem because they blew up the Capitol building, and now the president is not sure if you're going to have an award ceremony or not. And I said, well, you know, I wasn't anticipating one anyway. Everything's happened so confusing to me anyway. So they said, we got to delay the ceremony from February the 27th, and we're trying to reschedule it, so we'll let you know. And so, of course, my wife had already made plans to take her and the girls out to see Washington, D.C. She had coordinated with the escort officer, and he laid out a plan for what we were going to do and where we were going. And I asked her if she was satisfied with it. I didn't like the guy anyway. He was kind of pipsqueak guy, you know. And so anyway, so I said, well, are we going to stay here to get a medal, or when are they going to do it? I said, it don't matter to me, you know, but I want to go back to Vietnam because I got a company over there. And so he said, well, I'll let you know. And so finally, after about a day of not knowing, they finally come and told me that, okay, we've got it scheduled now for March the 2nd. You will go in and you will have your ceremony. And so I said, okay, that's great. And so we had a day and a half or something to kill. But I was so determined if I was going to receive that high an honor that I was going to dignify my damn family and eat in the hotel just like high-level people did, you know. And so I got everybody together and I said, tomorrow morning we're going to eat here in this room and we're going to order, and our government's going to pay for it regardless of what that colonel said. And so they all agreed. And so the next morning we got up with room service, and it was wonderful. They set up and we had room service in the room, and my daughters were thrilled. They couldn't believe that you know, you had service like that in the United States. And my wife was certainly thrilled, and we had breakfast in the room. Was the greatest part of me receiving the Medal of Honor. And so the colonel like to went crazy when he found out that and I told him, my escort will take care of it. You see that colonel, because he's responsible for paying the bill, and he'll take care of it. And so he come in to give us a schedule for that day, and he says, Captain Howard, I said, look, if you even mention about me having room service, sir, I will personally be insubordinate and kick you know what right here. I said, because, you know, I finally got something dignified in my life and my family, and I'm not going to let you deprive them of it. Now, you figure out how to pay it. If you can't figure out how to pay it, I don't want you to worry me with it, or even worry my family about it. And I said, from now on, you don't tell me anything. Do you understand that? And he says, well, the Chief of Staff of the Army wants to have an audience with you today, and the Secretary of Defense. And I said, that's great. And so when I went in to General Westmoreland, he said, Bob, how they're treating you? I said, terrible. I said, you know, they wouldn't even let us have room service, number one, and that colonel you put escorting us is worried about spending money, and you can't get your schedule straight. Now, General, you're a better general than that. You need to get that sorted out if you're going to treat me like a hero. And he said, by God, we'll get it sorted out. And so he says, we're going to take you in to see Melvin Laird, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of the Army wants to talk to you because his nephew was in your company in Vietnam and was missing at that time, and I didn't realize it. So I went in to see Melvin Laird, and this colonel had already told me, he said, the uniform that you're going to be in is class blues. And I said, no, sir. I will not go in to receive the Medal of Honor in a class. I didn't like class blues. That's a formal dress uniform. I will wear a Class A uniform, which is what I think is formal, not class blue uniform. And I will also wear blouse boots because I'm a Special Forces sergeant and I'm a paratrooper, and I was a captain at the time, I think sergeant, I told him. I thought I was still sergeant, but anyway. So he said, well, the Secretary of Defense don't agree with that. And then I said, well, I don't want the award. And I said, I'll tell him. And so when I got in to see the Secretary of Defense, he said, I understand, Bob, that you're dissatisfied that I asked you to be in the I said, yes, sir. I said, if you can't understand that I'm a Special Forces officer, and that's the only reason I'm a Special Forces officer, because we wear blouse boots and we're paratroopers, and I'm a paratrooper, and if I can't receive an award as a paratrooper, I don't want the award. And he said, well, you can wear your dress uniform if you want. I said, okay, sir. So they sorted that out. And anyway, so they had the ceremony set up, and so anyway, that same day I had to go in and see Secretary of the Army, Rezor was his name. And as a company commander, his nephew was in my company, and his last name was Mixter. His half-brother's son had joined the Army to be in Special Forces, and he was assigned to Vietnam, and he was selected for Special Operations, and he was assigned to my company. And I didn't realize it at the time. Well, his unit had been surrounded just like the patrol that I went in to try to save when I was nominated for the Medal of Honor. And it had actually, every one of them had been killed, and they decapitated Mixter. He was a tall kid, about 6'4", and they cut his head off and both arms and both feet off. And so I took a team in I thought we could at least get some of them out alive, but we were not able to do that, but they left the dead behind, and they were all mutilated for us to find, to let us know that they had found them. And so when I filled out the after-action report on that recovery operation, well, then the Secretary of the Army had that after-action report, and he knew I was directly involved in it. And we could not identify his nephew. And so, and I said, and I had to defend my position, there's no doubt in my mind that that was Mixter because of the size of his body and all, even though they took his head and they took his hand and they took his feet. And so everybody that went in with me on that recovery operation agreed with me, and that's what I put in the report. And so the secretary was pretty emotional. And so he had to report in front of me, and he let me know that he had to report in front of him. And so I talked to him, and I just said, Mr. Secretary, whether you agree with it or not, he's dead. He's not missing in action. I know him, and you know, I was on the recovery, and that was him, whether we could positively identify him or not. And so anyway, he started off pretty rough with me, but he calmed down, and both of us got a little emotional because I was in charge of the recovery of his nephew. And so that night I went back to the hotel again, and so they had replaced that colonel that had been escorting me, and they had another colonel, and he was a very nice guy. And he asked me, he said, where would you like to go tonight? And I said, well, you know, I said, I would like to go, my wife has mentioned to me that she would like to go to a theater, a real theater where they have a show. And since we're in Washington, D.C., she'd like to do that. And they took us to a show, a theater, where they actually had a show. And then after the theater, I would like to treat her to a dinner, a wonderful dinner. And I would like to have wine, a real, genuine dinner after the theater. And so, and I said, I'd like for my daughters to go to all of this, and of course my wife's aunt. And so they arranged it, and we went to a theater and went to a wonderful dinner. And the colonel was a great guy, and he had his wife with him, and they treated us like we were real people. And so that really calmed everything down. And then the next day was a ceremony. And so we had breakfast in our room service. And it was arranged, and I didn't have to arrange it that time. And so they told me that we're going to pick you up in front of the hotel, and the whole family's going to be there, but we'll put the family in one car, and we'll put you in the other car. And we're going right to the White House, and the president's going to meet you. And he's going to walk in, and then we're going to separate you. And then from the time we get in the White House, we'll have an escort to take you in the room where they're going to award you the Medal of Honor. And so that happened just that way. And so when we pulled up at the back of the White House, sure enough, President Nixon was there when they got me out of the car and welcomed me. And we walked in, and they had he said, for this ceremony, we're going to have the Army band. He said, we normally have the Marine Corps band, but said, we're going to have the Army band. And so I can remember walking in with the president, and then he excused himself and went off in one direction. And I had a bunch of people, Chief of Staff of the Army, General Westmoreland, and the Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, was there. They were all there, and they were guiding me toward this room. And so when I get into this room, I find that there are other Medal of Honor recipients in there. Wes Fox, a Marine colonel, was in the same ceremony, and a guy in a wheelchair named George Lang, and a guy from West Virginia. I don't remember his name. I haven't seen him. He don't go to these conventions since that time. And in the same ceremony, and I can remember lining up and the music playing, and the band playing, and all the family members of the other recipients moving in. And I can remember my wife trying to get over and get a hold of my arm, and my kids trying to get Daddy, you know, they're trying to get over to me, and they're trying to keep them away so that they can get us lined up. The president's going to come down and present these awards to you. And so then all at once the music plays, and they know that the president's coming in, and we're all lined up, and of course my wife and family's behind me. And they had a senator from the state of Texas at that time. He's dead now. I can't even remember his name. But he was standing there beside me, and so I can remember the president walking up in front of me, and of course I'd already met him when I got out of the car. And he took the Medal of Honor in his hand like that. And he said something, and I don't know what he said, but he was holding it in his hand, and they took a picture of it. And so I can remember looking at his hand, and I can remember that my heart felt like it stopped, and you know, because reflecting back over, you know, why am I here, and up to this point had not been good for me, and now I'm looking, and I can remember how decent his hand looked, and how it was beautiful. And the medal was laying in his hand, and I can remember there was a commotion going on, and they were trying to take a picture of it as he was speaking, and he said something, and then all at once he took it, and he's putting it around my neck, and he's saying something, and he said, "Captain Howard, are you okay?" He said, "You're looking pale." And I said, "Sir, I don't know if I'm going to faint or not, but I apologize for my looks, but I think my heart stopped beating." And he smiled, and I can remember as he put it around his neck, he let his cheek come over and hit me on the side of the face, and he said, "This great country appreciates you, Bob." And, you know, he kind of hooks the medal up, and of course there's people behind him trying to hook it up and all that stuff. And then I can remember he went down the line to each one of the recipients. And so when this is over with, and I can remember President Nixon, before he left the room, he gave me a special look and acknowledged me again, you know, with that kind of little smirky smile that he had. And that picture's still in my mind today as he's leaving the room. And then they told us that there's going to be a reception. And so I can remember my wife coming over, grabbing my hand, and I can remember my youngest daughter right here on my leg, hugging around my leg, and my other daughter over here hugging this leg, and they're all hugging me. And I can remember my wife's aunt coming over trying to hug me, and then all at once they're saying, they're just talking to me, and it didn't make sense. I'm kind of like I'm in a trance, you know. And then there's the Chief of Staff of the Army said, "Are you sick?" You know, said, "You're real pale." I almost passed out, you know, and I didn't realize it. But anyway, and so I said, "No, I'm okay." And then I'm talking, and then we go through in this little reception room, and there's the First Lady, Mrs. Nixon, and she was so gracious. You know, she met my wife's aunt, and they were talking, and then she hugged my wife, and then she hugged my two girls, and then she hugged me, and then she was kind of nervous when she hugged me, and so I'm saying, this is really the First Lady of the United States. She was such a gracious lady. And so she said, "Can I get you something?" And I said, I'd just like some coffee, ma'am. So she got us some coffee. And I'd made arrangements through my escort as soon as the reception was over to go to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And so then I can remember the reception was over, and I can remember my wife talking about how nice the president was and how nice Mrs. Nixon was. And I can remember her and my aunt talking about, they were really fascinated with Pat Nixon. You know, she was really a gracious lady. But they had a different perception. They thought she was real stern, and you know, before we got to Washington. Before, in the room when we were in Washington, they were curious on how, the people that had seen me said I turned totally pale. You know, there was a moment in my life where my whole physical features just was drained.
Now this is somebody, you have been through so much,
Yeah.
what you described, and yet.
Yes.
You must have been very
But it was
proud.
because, you know, I was so fascinated that when I told you I saw it in his hand looked almost beautiful. It was magnificent looking. And I'm reflecting back and I'm saying, why am I deserving of this moment? I'm saying to myself, you know, what honor do I deserve to be here? And it just seems like my mind just kind of leaves me and my heart stops beating. And I don't know what caused that, other than subconsciously I was so tied up in trying to relive some of the experiences that I had in getting to be honored with this ceremony. And so that's kind of what caused it, I guess.
What does the medal mean to you?
It has meant so much to me, and I've tried to always maintain the dignity and the honor of having it bestowed upon me. It's been, I don't talk about it unless I'm asked about it. I never tell anybody that I got it unless they find out and then ask me about it. It's been very special to me. I hold it very special. And I try to always remember that I wear that, but I don't wear it for myself. I wear it for all those soldiers that were unable to get back alive out of the war that I fought in. But more so, I have the responsibility to the youth and to my fellow man, American, to demonstrate that I still am worthy of wearing this medal. And so I hold it very dear to my heart. And you know, I don't know if I do a good job. I can only tell you that that it was a special calling to me. It changed my whole life. But the experiences that I had where I earned it has helped me save a lot of other lives too. And
How did it change your life? What do you mean by that?
it changed my life because with it is a responsibility to live up to it. It means that you have to be aware of everything you do. You don't want to get involved or violate any laws that would reflect upon you or upon your family members. And you're always aware of it, and you live with that. But there was an expectation of me in the military as I continued military service. I served with a lot of officers and non-commissioned officers that didn't appreciate me or the service that I had, and it was always in their mind, and they were kind of, you know, I went through a lot, and I served for officers that actually, you call it jealousy or what, but resented me because I had received the Medal of Honor in my profession. And I was always aware of that, and I was aware of the ones, and I could tell by their actions toward me that they resented me. And so I never used it for any personal gain in my profession. Every one of my promotions were earned, my performance was up to par, and I received those promotions like I should, and I earned my promotions. And I tried to lead by example in my profession. But in doing that, in my personal life didn't work out a lot because I ignored my family and didn't realize it at the time by spending so much time trying to make sure that I lived up to the expectation, my own expectation of how I should live in being a recipient of the Medal of Honor. So it changed my whole life in that aspect.
What do you want people to learn? I don't know if you ever speak to children and schools.
I do. I enjoy speaking to children, but I don't share the war experiences. It's hard.
What do you want them to learn from?
I want them to learn that everybody is important, regardless of what background you come from. But if you're willing to work hard, there's still an opportunity in America to move ahead. You know, we have an aspiration from the time we are born, and we're fortunate if we're born as an American, that you can earn and get what you earn in America, but you have to earn it. And there's opportunity available to you in this democracy and this great country to do that. And I want them to learn discipline and to be able to respect the heritage of our country, to appreciate what God has given us and those blessings. And that's what I try to talk to them about.
And the word freedom?
And freedom, that's inherent in everything we do, is worth fighting for. And I felt the same way. Freedom was an underlying reason, I guess, that I survived every battle that I was ever in Vietnam, because I didn't want to lose that freedom, or what I perceived as freedom, losing freedom. And losing my life, or being captured by the enemy, or being unable to fight, or something like that, yes.
And two other last questions. I get the feeling that teamwork is, or your fellow soldiers are really important.
It's hard I tried to create that so much in my life, but it's so hard to get. But you know, in small unit operations in Vietnam, and teamwork is so important. You know, I can take 2 or 3 people, and it's amazing to me how much you accomplish if you can get their cooperation and get them to appreciate what they can contribute to the teamwork, regardless of whether you're in business or you're in a combat situation, or even teamwork in going to school, you know. Working together as a team to learn, you know, and appreciate each other and learn from each other. It's so difficult to create teamwork in the military even, but that's the challenge you get in a military profession, is teamwork in everything that you do. You've got to have each other's support, and you work together and you coordinate your efforts, and we're not too good in doing that. And it's almost impossible, because you always got people that are not willing to contribute, not willing to devote the long hours, not willing to study, not willing to learn, people that want to take the easy way out, and I've always believed you only get for what you work for, and so that's kind of the way I live my life.
Okay, and this is the last question. You mentioned earlier that when you got the medal, you wanted to go to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
Yeah.
Why was that so important to you?
It was so important because my father and three of his brothers were drafted, and the youngest uncle was volunteered to go to the Second World War. My father and all of my uncles died as a result of their service during the Second World War. Three of my uncles did not return home and are left somewhere, their pieces on a battlefield in Europe. And I went to a ceremony with my grandmother in 1958 for those three that didn't return, for the first official ceremony for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier by President Eisenhower in 1958. And so when I received that honor, I felt that I was sharing it with members of my family that had sacrificed their lives in the Second World War, and my family knew that, and they knew why I wanted to go to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And I think, too, with that in the back of my mind, and receiving that honor was part of my reaction when President Nixon put that around my neck, because I was thinking about Grandma, and I was thinking about my dad, and I was thinking about my uncles, and so, you know, that was why.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love this beautiful.
Ceremony in Korea, and so I had been obligated to that, and I felt so strongly about speaking to the soldiers over there that I didn't come to the last one they had.
You're a wonderful speaker.
So,
Can't even begin to comprehend what you went through. So you were training soldiers in special forces afterwards?
yes, ma'am. I spent all of my time in Special Forces, Rangers, and Airborne Type units.
I was really curious what you learned. You started to talk about it, we just simply don't have time here today, but the soldiers who were so afraid that day, it sounded like you learned something